Well, good day, everyone. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. Tina Brown is with me today. She's probably best known to many of you for really capturing the zeitgeist of an era while editor of Vanity Fair and The New Yorker. Before moving to New York, she was the editor of Tatler in London, and she went on to co-found both Talk Magazine as well as The Daily Beast. She's also a well-known commentator and author, including the famous Diana Chronicles, and her most recent book is The Palace Papers, Inside the House of Windsor, and The Truth and the Turmoil. It was published earlier this year, fittingly, by Crown Publishing. The Washington Post has called it addictively readable, and I've just finished the book myself, and I can attest to that. She joins today thanks to the efforts of our mutual friend and my colleague, Kathleen Lacey. So Tina, thank you for joining, and it's good to see you again.
Happy to be here, Kevin.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about your book and the institution of the monarchy, but I can't help today but start with perhaps a more damaged institution at the moment, and that is what's going on at Downing Street. Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, has been called before the head of the 1922 committee. We've obviously seen a few cabinet resignations, and most significantly, of course, the ascension of Jeremy Hunt to Chancellor, and I would say effectively shadow Prime Minister at the moment. But I have to ask what your take is on the situation emerging in London right now.
Well, I just got back from London, and of course, you can almost hear the crashing masonry of this Tory party. And in many ways, I mean, it is the sort of inevitable unraveling that started, of course, in 2016 with the Brexit referendum. We've had, 4 prime ministers since, and an increasing kind of fantasy narrative that they all live in about Brexit having been a great idea, and the whole party is still really at war with itself. So, I mean, it's a very scary situation actually right now, and rather painful to watch. Liz Truss, who should never have been put into this position, completely unqualified to be in it, literally being sort of dismembered in front of us. It's quite a unique moment in England.
And it seems, this notion of trying to promise your population Northern European standards of social welfare at American levels of taxation was just never going to get anywhere ultimately.
No, well, it never had any base except in a kind of very small wing of the Tory party. The interesting and amusing thing, although it's horrific, is my book is the subline of my book, The Palace Papers, is "Can the Monarchy Survive?" Right. Well, actually, it's not the monarchy that's having a nervous breakdown. It's the government, and who would have thought it? This is why history is so interesting. That in fact, the reverse.
Right, precisely. So, this gets us to the big subject of your book, of course, which is this nexus of the monarchy, the institution of the monarchy, government and politics in the United Kingdom, and society writ large. And so I want to get to the book. Before I do, I have to ask you, and for those who are unfamiliar with the book basically chronicles the era between the death of Princess Diana and the death of Prince Philip last year. And we all remember the sort of iconic photos of the Queen at St. George's Chapel at Windsor, sitting alone, observing the COVID protocols, while the very night before, Boris Johnson was partying at Downing Street with his colleagues, and that was one of the elements that ultimately led to his downfall. But I want to ask you about what's happened since the end of the book. So on September the 8th, at the age of 96, and after 70 years as monarch, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II did pass away at Balmoral. And I know you arrived in London in time for the funeral, and you were commentating for American television. But what did you find when you arrived in London in that extraordinary week?
Well, I actually had thought that the reaction might be more hysterical than it was. The reaction, in fact, was almost as if the last act of the Queen, who has always been so impeccable herself, was to kind of excite from her nation a completely appropriate and beautiful sort of response to her death. I mean, we saw the 5 mile queue, which became in itself a kind of iconic thing, the queue in caps, stretching, mile after mile as her people of every age, ethnicity, class. I mean, it was an extraordinary display of sort of national unity. People waiting 12, 13, 15 hours to file past the catafalque, which had her coffin on it. It was remarkable. And of course, the Queen herself, I mean, I had learned when I was there in August in Scotland, the Queen had actually said to members of her Privy Council that she hoped that she would die in Scotland because that's where she wanted to go, in her most private estate at Balmoral, in a place where she felt it was really her happy place, where she'd been used to go with Philip and the family. And of course, in dying in Scotland, it was really her last act of soft power because the Union is once again in jeopardy. It was the Queen's, frankly, private sort of the notion of losing Scotland from the Union with another referendum was something that she cared enormously about, though she would never speak about it publicly, except to make one very cryptic comment when she said in the last referendum, people should think carefully before doing this. And in dying there, of course, it meant that the whole of that first period was focused on Scotland, and it made the Scots feel they were at the heart of the Union instead of the periphery of the Union. You saw this extraordinary, progress of the coffin through the countryside of Scotland and lying in state at St. Giles Cathedral. And so everything began in Scotland, the Scottish Union flag over her coffin. It was a very, very moving thing. And Nicola Sturgeon, actually, who's someone I know very well, and I actually admire enormously. She is a firebrand, and she does want Scottish independence. But there's Nicola Sturgeon, who's been, is always been the firebrand for independence. She's always said she wanted to keep the British monarchy, but there she was in a black, big black sort of society woman's hat, reading from the lessons in church. Somehow, and reinforcing to everybody, we want to keep the monarch as head of state. So it was a remarkable thing the Queen sort of managed to pull off in her extraordinary, impeccable way.
And indeed, on this point of whether Scotland, if it were to gain independence, could potentially maintain the monarch as head of state, is obviously not unprecedented in the history of the island of Great Britain.
Oh, no. I think that nobody has suggested losing. And of course, as the British parliamentary system just seems to be in riot, it kind of makes the point that the solidity and the traditional historical sort of the way that the monarchy is such a kind of stable institution, essentially. It's made the point. I mean, we want to keep that, right? That's the message.
Well, I've oftentimes wondered in recent years, and I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this as well, and that there's always been this question: if you were going to do away with a monarchy, would you replace it with what? And one of the great benefits of having this figure that sort of rises above politics and is a constant and is always there, when you've got the shenanigans of, say, a Boris Johnson, or you have a highly polarized situation, that society and the body politic can always look to this constant. And even here in the United States, we sometimes have to call into question whether having head of state and head of government united in one position is always for the best, because head of state is what's going to be putting forward that's your face to the world, in a sense, and clearly a lot of that has been undermined in recent years.
Yeah, well, there's certainly no political figure who could have brought out the crowds that the Queen did during her Jubilee in June of this year. There just is no one else. And it was interesting, actually, that the only person booed in that entire 3 days of the Jubilee was actually Boris Johnson. Even Harry and Meghan, who are not the most popular figures in the monarchy, they were not booed. But Boris Johnson was booed. So that kind of really made that point. I mean, there is something of value, obviously, in having the monarchy as, over overmighty politicians. They are, because they can bring out a fervor essentially that is patriotic without being nationalistic, and that is a huge difference. I mean, when you saw that remarkable procession that was so moving and so deep and rich in tradition, and the incredible regiments of these various military units that were celebrating, or rather memorializing the Queen. It was not a martial display. I mean, it was a display of history, of tradition, of patriotic moments and symbols that really brought everybody together, whatever their politics or persuasion. That's a very hard thing to do for anybody who's, part of the sort of political, round who's elected.
So I want to go back to something you said early on, when you said you arrived in London in time for the Queen's state and royal funerals, that you perhaps were even expecting a little bit more hysteria. And I want to go back to something you wrote in the book. You go back to 2002, at the time of the death of the Queen Mother, and obviously the Queen's sister had died earlier that year, Princess Margaret. The monarchy was still suffering from the kind of the hangover of the Diana years. And you write about that there was this concern at the time of the funeral of the Queen Mother about whether anybody would kind of show up. And then obviously you have the contrast of nobody had really anticipated just how out of control the Diana situation was going to get when she passed away in the week leading into that funeral. Now, obviously there was never any concern that nobody would show up for the Queen's funeral, but was there ever any concern, or was there a surprise on your part or the palace's part that actually there was enough, I don't know what you want to call it, grief doesn't seem quite the right word, but there was something going on to sustain that many days of people going through Westminster Hall to see her, the lining in the streets, the sort of, I mean, from our perspective here in the United States, it appeared that the country had virtually shut down for that week.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was really a valedictory, not only to the Queen herself, but to her whole ethos and way of serving her country. I think that the great desire to wait that long. I mean, who waits? I mean, even David Beckham, for goodness sake, waited 13 hours in the queue like everybody else. And indeed, jumping the queue with sort of VIP status was so frowned on that the two of the British talk show hosts were accused of jumping the queue. And they were they dealt for a week with like people, tweeting hideous things about them the entire week. So yeah, I mean, it was that part of it was a remarkable development, but it really was about. I mean, in some ways, I mean, the Queen she behaved so well. I mean, in 70 years, I was actually on a discussion in London about times when people could think of the Queen having made a mistake or got it wrong. There was a ransacking of the memory to try to think of any time that the Queen had got it wrong, except for the time during Diana's death. But aside from that period, she really never erred from her duty. And that is such a kind of remarkable thing in terms of today's short-term gratification, desire to express self. I mean, we still don't know really what the Queen thought about anything. And I think we're going to really miss not knowing what she thought. Everybody wants to air their opinions. Everybody wants to thinks that they have something to say of interest. The Queen took the long view always, and actually it worked for her, not telling us what she thought, because it meant that people with her inscrutableness could somehow really project their feelings on her. And the self-discipline of observing that for 7 decades was something that people truly, they respected and mourned its passing. There was a sense of like, what are we today? Can any of us do this today? And so people wanted to say thank you to her, actually. They really did. Again and again, that was what the people in the line said. Well, she served us, impeccably, for 70 years. It's the least we can do, is what they kept saying, is to be here for her and wait. I thought it was a wonderful tribute, really.
Absolutely. And in fact, the day after her death, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, which read in part, "She lived long enough to kiss off her 14th Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and welcome her 15th to form Her Majesty's government. So from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, one would love to know, and never will, what the privately astringent Queen Elizabeth thought about this particular arc of history. I mean, who knows, but I think we all thought it, right? I mean, Churchill and then Johnson and Truss. So over to you, Charles. And indeed, I have to say, Tina, just as you were speaking right now, the news has hit that Liz Truss will be stepping down, and a leadership election is going to be pursued in the next week. She's come to agreement with Sir Graham Brady and the 1922 committee. So
it's really stunning, and it's actually horrible. And I'm sad for my gender that it ended this way for Liz Truss. I mean, really, it's embarrassing and for the country and deeply troubling.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, after all is said and done, there's been a lot of water under the bridge, it appears at this point that the now King Charles III has got quite a lot of public support. Heaven knows he's had a better 7 weeks, clearly, than the Prime Minister has. And clearly, nobody has had as much prep time for their job as he has. But how do you see the Carolean age now getting off to a start?
Well, the irony for Prince Charles, King Charles, I must say now, is that though he's waited all of this time for his role, and he's been in the anteroom of his destiny now for 40 years certainly. It was agony for him many years when, in his 40s and 50s, to him to keep waiting and being the man, in the shadows, the understudy, etc. And even the last 2 years of the Queen's life, I think, was pretty tough for him, because he was she was ailing, and he never knew when he'd be called on to step in. And it was a really hard, I think, couple of years. But nonetheless, the moment he steps in turns out to be, in this magical way, the perfect time. Because, one thing we do know about Prince Charles, for all of the travails with Diana and, the fact that we sort of know so much about what he thinks, he really is a true leader in the environmental and climate change space. For years, he was mocked as being a, quote, crank for his passionate espousing of organic farming and of, no plastic and, all of these things that we now sort of take for granted, essentially, as the critical things that have to be addressed. He was talking about it years before anybody else. Even his own family would make fun of him, And so really, he now is a genuine authority in this place. So he doesn't really, people will go, well, he can't talk about those things now. He's king. Yes, he can. He does not have to actually play this role exactly as his mother did. Clearly, he cannot campaign or make political statements. He can't show up and start talking about, energy prices or whatever. He can't do that. But what he can do is be a great convening monarch in these areas that he cares about, which are, disadvantaged young people, which he's done an enormous amount to help with his Prince's Trust charity, arts and culture, which he cares tremendously about, and of course, above all, climate change. So actually, there's a lot that Charles cares about that everybody else cares about too. And I think that he will be able to show, and already has shown, a little more emotion than the Queen showed. I think for Charles, the inscrutable face doesn't really work, but at the same time, he doesn't have to go too far in the other direction and start emoting on every talk show. But he can. When he spoke about his mother's death, he showed his grief. And it was very moving, I thought, actually, that he did. So there's quite a lot of emotion in Charles, and I think that it'll resonate, as a matter of fact. We know that he was advised by the government not to go to the COP meeting at Sharm el-Sheikh. I personally think he should have been able to go to that. I think there's nothing wrong with Charles, who really is the leader in that space, going and making a very moving and passionate speech about, the fate of the planet and how it has to be protected. I don't think that should be regarded as a political topic for Charles. But, he obviously wanted to be absolutely rigorous and in observing what the government wanted. But I think he sort of had the last laugh on that, actually. I wouldn't be surprised if he did end up going. Even if he doesn't, we know what he thinks. And that essentially, in this instance, I think is a good thing for Charles.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, in a sense, actually, all of this time leading up, all of this time as the heir apparent, was not used poorly, in the sense that even if he does have to pull back from overtly political statements, or that which was perceived to potentially be overtly political statements, he laid the groundwork. Everybody knows he had these prescient views on things like climate change, on organic agriculture and whatnot. And even if he is quieter now, that foundation is there and underpins his leadership. But
another thing too, Kevin, which is just to say is that he's a great statesman at this point. He's met everybody. I mean, when you think about it, Charles, from cradle to now, has always been, marinated in these affairs of state. I mean, from the age of 21, he was, traveling the world, always meeting. And so now he knows many leaders, parents and families and he knows, and he's met with, off the record, all of these people. And we saw in the reception that he hosted at Buckingham Palace for the Queen's, funeral, who else could have convened all those world leaders? Who else could get the Emperor of Japan to travel in a bus? I mean, they were all falling over themselves to be included in the Buckingham Palace reception. Macron and, I mean, all of them. They just wanted to be there. And I don't think anyone else could have convened that group. And they do have a respect for King Charles. So I think it's actually kind of a rather amazing thing we're seeing, actually, which is a great kickoff to the Carolean age.
So I have to ask you this, though, because it strikes me that for a lot of young people, particularly in Britain, they weren't around at the time of all the travails of Diana and certainly her tragic death. But a lot of people's perception of the monarchy and of the individuals who are in the royal family is now shaped by the popular Netflix show The Crown. I mean, we all binge it the weekend it drops, right? But it occurs to me that it is about to pick up at the worst possible moment for Charles. That the new season is essentially going to cover the dissolution of that marriage that really cast him as the bad guy, as well as the now Queen Consort Camilla, the then Camilla Parker Bowles. So is the palace concerned about the impact of this show as they're trying to launch this new reign?
They're very, very concerned. Season 5 and season 6 are something that they all dread very much. And actually, you're seeing now daily a kind of assault on the show, essentially, of saying people coming out. I mean, Judi Dench just wrote a letter to the Times saying, how cruel it is to do this series now, that it's too close to their real lives, these people. You have John Major, the former Prime Minister, very, very angry that apparently, and we haven't seen it yet, so it's also in some ways obviously unfair till people have seen it, but I gather that in the show, and John Major certainly has heard this, there's a scene in which Charles is essentially kind of asking him to persuade the Queen to abdicate and almost plotting, it seems, for that. And I've never heard that. And I mean, John Major absolutely rubbished it and said this is absolute, fallacy. And so there's a real campaign to have a disclaimer at the beginning saying this is not fact. It's hard for them because you can't really promote a counter narrative to something that has such a powerful hold of people's imaginations, because it's frankly so well done, right? I mean, as you say, we all binge it. It's a wonderful show. I mean, it's gripping, it's fabulous, it's so well done. The acting is sublime. I mean, the last series, the Emma Corrin, who played Diana, was absolutely perfect. I met Diana many times, and it was a flawless rendition of Diana. We don't know what the new Diana casting is going to be for her later years, but it's very, very tough. And I think particularly a source of trepidation for Camilla, the now Queen Consort, because for 17 years now she's been married to Charles. I mean, she's now been married to Charles longer than Diana was. She's been absolutely stalwart, stoic, discreet, hardworking, done her duty, and really won for the first time, the esteem of the public. She's popular now. She really is. I mean, she's never going to be like a Diana, but she's respected and she's popular. if she's shown as the sort of, frankly, as Diana said, the third person in the marriage, the person who caused, the beautiful, heartbroken princess, all of this pain, a whole generation who weren't even alive. I mean, think about it. It's 25 years since Diana died. So there's a whole generation now that weren't even around when the Diana story was playing out, or were just children. So that's very tough for them. And, it does raise the question about how close you can come to somebody's life when they're around, they're alive, and they, it's not as they remember it.
So as I read your book, talking about television shows, when I was reading your book, I have to say that the show that came to mind more than The Crown was actually the HBO show Succession. Because not that there was ever any question of who was going to ultimately succeed the Queen, but this notion that we're kind of watching this family and its travails. It's kind of like the Anna Karenina thing, right? I mean, all happy families are alike, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. And we saw that being played out in a very public way, some of which was done by them themselves, right? The cultivating of the media and so on and so forth. But that there was, I think, sometimes a misunderstanding that the Queen was not only mother and grandmother, et cetera, but she was also the CEO of this institution that she had a responsibility to perpetuate. And that there were in moments where, Harry can't get a meeting with his grandmother when he's trying to negotiate his stepping back. She needed to act as CEO. When it was time to cut off Andrew after the revelations of him, with Jeffrey Epstein, she had to act as CEO, and then later on acted as mother by essentially paying off or covering the settlement in a sense. But talk about this notion of head of the firm, as the family itself calls the institution, and duties as a family member.
Well, I mean, of course, the fascination of writing this saga of the House of Windsor is that, on the one hand, you have the 1,000-year-old institution, the monarchy, but it's held up on the frail shoulders, of course, of fallible people. I mean, the Queen, in some ways, it's been very challenging for her family that the Queen was so darn impeccable for 70 years. How could anybody else live up to that? I mean, the others are simply fallible people who have, love affairs and divorces and problems and issues with money, and they are far more sort of vulnerable in a sense. They to media scrutiny, and of course the media age itself has changed. When the Queen took over, she took over in the era of deference, when monarchy was written about in a very sort of polite way, and of course we get all the way along, and now it's just crazy TikTok memes and coverage 24/7, and they're turned into these celebrity fodder. I mean, the Daily Mail online, I mean, it's just astounding. I think there were 9 Meghan Markle stories yesterday. But so it's a challenge. But the Queen, most of the time, got it right with her family. And Philip, of course, was extremely important. I mean, he was the sort of the family enforcer. He was the one who she kind of turned to. You deal with it, Philip. And he did. When she lost Philip, it really became for her at the end very difficult, because as she got older, it was so hard sometimes for her to separate her feelings as a mother and a grandmother from her necessity of her sovereign duties. But frankly, the Crown always won. The Crown always won. The sovereign duties, or if there was a real choice, as there was with Andrew or there was with Megxit, she would have to. She always, in the end, protected the Crown. I mean, the only time, when we talked about Diana not getting it right at the time of Diana's death, one reason she didn't, quote, get it right was because she was being a grandmother in Balmoral. Her 2 grandsons had lost their mother in the most horrific circumstances, and it was absolutely traumatic. She was isolated with her family there. She was really being a grandmother at that time. And so, yes, she delayed too long for public appetite, coming back to London. But that meant she had to wrench herself away, essentially, and come down and behave as the sovereign. And she did in the end. But, you saw that moment as being the conflict of being the mother and the sovereign. Similarly, actually, with Megxit, which was, as painful for her in a way, perhaps more so that it was for Prince Harry, because she adored Prince Harry. I mean, he's right about that. She always loved Harry. He was fun. She adored him. Because the boys had lost their mother so young. She was a very involved grandmother, and yet she could not say yes to the Sussexes about what they actually wanted, which was to essentially be part-time royals, to be royals when they wanted to be royals, and entertainment, multimillionaires when they weren't. It could not be reconciled. I mean, perhaps it could have been handled more imaginatively, but ultimately the outcome had to really be the same, which is, as Philip, put it, and had on other occasions when other members of the family wanted also to be off, kind of leveraging essentially their brand of monarchy, was you're in or you're out. In the same way in politics, I mean, you really can't be coining money in and taking money and so on when you are actually supposed to be doing public service. It's just very hard to reconcile. So, I mean, the way it was handled by them was very impulsive. But the Queen, at the end of the day, she had to sort of stand by the monarchy, even though it meant that they left. And there was this very critical moment. I mean, when Harry said on the Oprah interview, he blamed the kind of grey men essentially around the Queen. And people love to kind of talk about the grey men. There is a deep state, it's true, at Buckingham Palace, layers upon layers, obviously, of turf protecting courtiers. That is still true. However, he was being naive when he said, the Queen, his grandmother, he'd arranged to go to Balmoral, to Sandringham, when these discussions were happening at the beginning of 2020, and he was going to go to Sandringham in January, talk to his grandmother, have tea with her, and then her private secretary, Edward Young, stepped in, and all of a sudden it was, the Queen's diary is too full, and it was cancelled. Well, he's being naive, because one of the close people there said to me, the children and grandchildren always knew that there was two versions of the Queen. If you were going to see your granny, your mother, to talk about issues of your life, your thing, your private relationships, she was absolutely warm and cozy, and come and see me, have tea, have fun. If you were going to talk to her about anything that impacted the public nature of monarchy, you were going to find that she was at a long table with her private secretaries, your private secretaries, notebooks, minutes taken. I mean, she was the CEO. And that's what Harry found, of course, that when he did go to what then was called the Sandringham Summit, it was all these private secretaries. It was the Queen at the head of the table. And people who think that it was sort of then run by the deep state, actually, that's not true. I mean, as I found in my reporting, the Queen was very much in the chair in that meeting. And she said, no. I mean, it was the worst deal anyone could imagine. Basically, Harry got nothing that he asked for. Nothing. I mean, they had to give up, pay back the money on Frogmore House. They had to, he had to lose his military patronages, which was very painful for Harry. And I think myself was something that, perhaps he could have been left with, given how well he served in Afghanistan and how bravely and what a great soldier he was. But again, you're in or you're out. You don't get those patronages if you're not a public servant, which is what, being a working royal, as it's called, is. It was a very painful moment, I think, for her too. And I think it's sad that it couldn't have been better resolved before her death. It was a painful last year for her to have to deal with this sort of unhappiness and vocal unhappiness of the Sussexes.
That's a perfect segue, though, to what I wanted to ask you next, because toward the end of the book, or at the very end of the book, actually, you write, while we celebrate the mightiness of Elizabeth II's allegiance to a life of service, we should acknowledge that an antiquated version of monarchy must now pass into history. So I'm wondering, what do you think that means in terms of what this institution is likely to look like? Because I'm struck by two things. One is that, and we've already heard to some degree about Charles sort of having a more stripped down coronation in May of next year. But after watching what we did in September, you mentioned it at the top of the call. this absolutely precision display that nobody else in the world can do but the Brits, and that you have this sort of martial display, but it doesn't have this kind of the same military overtones as militaries marching down the streets in Moscow or Beijing or in Pyongyang, right? And it was how they pulled it off is just extraordinary. But that is also what we, the world, expect out of them. And they don't do that, then it's kind of like they're just one of these minor monarchies elsewhere in Europe, as an example. This is an industry for the United Kingdom, as it is in a sense. But the second element is going to what you were talking about earlier, that you're either in or you're out. And if the king is now and the Prince of Wales are going to strip this thing down to a more streamlined operation, it begs the question of what happens to these other, now the minor royals, I guess, if you would call them, because if they have to go out and earn their own living, in a sense, and yet everybody who wants them because there's that star power and that proximity to the crown, and that's what people want to monetize in a way. How do they balance that without them, becoming just entertainment fodder?
I think it's very, very difficult. In fairness to those minor royals, I mean, I do think it's very difficult. It only really works if it's happened from the get-go, so they have no expectations of it. Princess Anne's two children, she very shrewdly, and typical of Princess Anne, who I adore, she's such a kind of pragmatic, smart, beautiful woman. It's extraordinary. She basically said from the beginning, I don't want my children to be princes and princesses. I don't want them to be HRH. And they're not. They've had actually a pretty successful private time. Zara is a very successful equestrian and Olympic rider, and her husband, is a former rugby star. He's actually now, though, just accepted to take part in the Britain's most popular reality show. I'm a celebrity, get me out of here, right? And so, he's doing that, and he's going to be paid £150,000 for doing it, probably. So that's a question about what do we think about that. And Peter Phillips, the brother, he's a business guy, and I mean, he's it seems able to negotiate all of that. But it depends on the kind of life you lead. I mean, basically, the only way, essentially, for them to have these successful private lives, if they really become rather low-key business people, which is what happens a lot in Europe, if they are more flamboyant and they want to be out there in the public eye, that immediately starts to raise the question of leveraging the brand again. And, the press are just going to kill them for it. I mean, they have to recognize it's not simply the rules of monarchy. It's also the media. You're going to have to face the fact that they'll never be off your case. They're never going to be off your case. So it's very tough, actually, for them. I mean, they want to earn, they want to go out and earn. Most of them haven't really been trained to do much. And so what are they going to do? It's actually better, though, that they are genuinely out, genuinely sort of in the world of whatever they want to be in, sports, business, real estate, whatever they want to do. It's better that they do that as out. Otherwise, you have this kind of nefarious thing of them being sort of, it's like what got Prince Andrew into all of this trouble, essentially. Never had a feeling he had enough money, even though many would feel he had plenty of money. But I mean, in terms of the people that they mixed with, he always felt he didn't have enough money, and nor did his wife. And the same thing actually with Prince Michael of Kent, the Queen's cousin. I mean, he recently got into trouble for sort of brokering, deals with people who were considered inappropriate or whatever. So very difficult. And it hasn't been properly worked out. And I don't know that the palace, I don't think that really Charles can ever really understand that, because, they think they do. But if you have been raised from the cradle to be royal, it's not necessarily going to mean you have the best, smartest sort of PR perspective on things.
So, at the risk of a record scratch sort of turn here, I can't have you on here and not turn to the media and journalism more specifically. So, I think for those in the audience who are perhaps less familiar with your background, it is worth reminding people that you became editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair magazine at the age of 31. entrusted with this storied brand that was trying to be revived by Cy Newhouse, who was running Condé Nast and owned Condé Nast at the time. And you became editor-in-chief of Tatler at the age of 25. I mean, tell us a little bit about, the magazine world at the time and what it was that you saw. What did you see that you were going to be able to bring to these kind of storied titles and be given that responsibility, and that your bosses saw in you and entrusted you with these titles? It's a fascinating story.
Well, I mean, Tatler was just the most incredible romp for me. They had it was bought. It was a very old storied title, a 270-year-old title that had sort of degenerated into being a kind of sad little Chinese sheet. And it was bought by a real estate guy who sort of wanted to break into magazine media and turn into a sort of a proper magazine. So he asked every sort of journalist of any note in London if they wanted to edit it, and they all turned him down. So then he thought, well, I better go to Youth. And I had been writing quite often on topics that were sort of rather in Tatler's realm. And so he took a risk on me, for which I'll always be very grateful. I knew nothing when I took it over. But one of the things that I learned as a maxim is if you don't have a budget, get yourself a point of view, right? Because, I mean, our budget was £10,000 a year. I hired, essentially my friends, which I guess everybody does at the beginning of their career. I hired my friends and they all turned out to be very, very good. In fact, my sort of young intern ended up being, chairman of Condé Nast. He's now chairman of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I mean, others there turned into major figures in journalism. So I actually had a good sort of base of very talented sort of young Turks, if you like. And I wanted to bring out, I knew immediately that the way to go at that moment when Mrs. Thatcher had just taken over was irreverence. It was what I, my own nature to be irreverent as a writer and as a sort of satiric eye, if you like. So I turned Tatler into very much a very irreverent look at high society, taking it away from the old-fashioned sort of hunting, shooting, and fishing mandate to a far more irreverent, cafe society, a combination of glamour as well as class. And it was a very, very fun magazine, and it still is, actually. I mean, the personality of Tatler was so strong that the DNA that was implanted there is still very much present. And the new editor, I think, is particularly good and sort of very much following our way. Vanity Fair, of course, was started by Condé Nast, because at the end of my Tatler spell, this real estate guy sold it to Condé Nast. So that's how I came into their ken, as it were, in the English company. They launched Vanity Fair in New York. It was in 83. It was an instant, dreadful belly flop. They had a lot of hype. And then it fell on its face. It was totally mocked as a terrible sort of turkey. They put in another editor very quickly. They fired the founding editor. They put another editor in who was plucked from the sort of old guard of Condé Nast as a caretaker editor. And then they basically signed Newhouse, who was really, he was wonderful. I mean, the sense that he took risks on people, and he turned to me and he said, look, you did this with Tatler. Why don't you come to New York? So it's a long story how I ended up, getting to that point with him. But my goal, my task was, you've got sort of 6 months. I mean, either we fold it or we give it a last shot. And I knew what I wanted to do. I mean, you asked about how or whatever. I mean, I did have a vision, and I loved magazines. I was very good at finding, I had a great story sense and a sense of the zeitgeist, which has always been something I kind of was able to resonate with. And so I turned the Vanity Fair into this sort of the mirror of the Reagan age, as it were, and basically started the whole kind of, I'm afraid, celebrity journalism of that era, combined with very, very strong narratives, reporting narratives. I mean, the whole concept of Vanity Fair was, glamorous package and very sort of, muscular content, if you like, in reporting and storytelling and great photography. So, I was able to build that magazine back from being, we'd had 25 pages of advertising when we started. And by the time I left, I mean, we had 250 pages. It became a very successful indeed, sort of the flagship, if you like, of Condé Nast by the time I left.
And a similar ascent in terms of circulation, right? So, but the only thing better than having a point of view is having a point of view with the budget that you would hope for, and it seemed like you wielded that well.
I got that with Vanity Fair. That was what was the joy of Vanity Fair. It was, okay, you've got more than a point of view. Now you have a budget. Now you can actually pay for the writers, and we went from about 200,000 circulation to 1.2 million. Yeah, it was a great commercial success.
And having phenomenal writers, like you say, who could devote themselves, had the time and the budget to be able to devote themselves to some serious long-form journalism. You had like this mix that you were talking about of celebrity journalism, obviously the absolutely phenomenal photography that Annie Leibovitz and Herb Ritz and Richard Avedon and others brought to the table, but also serious long-form journalism that actually wound up getting optioned for films in many instances and the like.
And of course, that's what I wanted. It was doing that after 8 years that made Cy Newhouse then say, okay, I've got this other problem now, which is the New Yorker.
Right, to go to, and then that was an even bigger responsibility in a way. You were only the fourth editor in the history of one of the most storied magazine titles in the world, and you didn't have the crutch, if you will, of phenomenal photography, right? It was text heavy. How did you then make that transition?
Well, again, I really, the first one he talked to me about it, I didn't really see myself as editor of that magazine until I went into the libraries and I looked at the very, very early rendition of the New Yorker in the 20s and 30s. And I saw that actually it was quite a different magazine from what it had become in the 70s and 80s. It had much more vitality. It had a range of short and long pieces instead of all great big long impenetrable pieces. It had tremendous artwork, full page cartoons by people like Charles Addams and Peter Arno. And I thought, my God, I could do this again. I could actually do the new version of this. And that's what I did. I brought visuals into the magazine. I brought a whole raft of incredible artists such as Ed Sorel and Art Spiegelman, who was very famous for his mouse cartoon book. I had a female cartoon editor who was actually Art's wife, who was absolutely not an illustrations editor. I gave the cartoonists free rein, created a whole issue for them, and really celebrated the cartoonists in a big way. I brought Richard Avedon as the very first staff photographer to the New Yorker, and most of all, I actually replaced a whole bunch of writers. I mean, look, I had to clear the stables essentially of 40 or 50 of the old guard, keep the best, like the great Roger Angell and John Updike and Lillian Ross, and then bring in the new ones. And I hired, David Remnick, I had Jeffrey Toobin, I had Jane Mayer, I had Ken Auletta, I had, so I brought in these great writers, and they're still there to this day. I mean, again, we achieved something that was a new template for a reimagined New Yorker that would be, essentially we woke up the Sleeping Beauty. And I'll always be very proud of the fact that we did save the New Yorker with that very difficult and challenging first few years.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that that's, budget, point of view, and that knack for being able to identify the zeitgeist that we were talking about earlier are all absolutely critical. I think people forget when you started Talk Magazine, and you had this eye for talent, and your original political columnists were Jake Tapper and Tucker Carlson. Now, half of our audience will probably thank you for that, and half of our audience will probably be unforgiven for that. But
but it was pretty good spotting in both of them. I mean, they're actually both really good writers.
Yeah, but what happened ultimately? I mean, I think you talked about the weight of these magazines as the advertising pages built up, and there was almost this blur. I mean, obviously the photographers that you hired did beautiful work, but the advertising and the types of advertisers that you had in there did almost artistic work themselves. The paper stock was heavy. I mean, these magazines were luxury goods, and it's why everybody up and down Park Avenue here and elsewhere in this city. It was must read, and I feel like in many ways not just to pick on Vanity Fair, but I mean just in general that this era has passed. I mean, there's obviously the iconic pictures of you and your late husband sitting in the diner every morning. You got every newspaper in the world stacked up there, and you had all the magazines stacked up there. Now we see you just with the newspapers stacked up. Like, what's happened to the magazine?
Now I sit there with my phone. It's all changed. I mean, the digital disruption changed everything, and everything has become disaggregated. And, magazines really were an art form of words, pictures, paper, headlines, glossy stock, but very expensive to produce, very expensive to distribute. And now the content, of course, has become completely disaggregated. I mean, to be honest, magazine junkie though I am, I really, read very few magazines. I read on my phone, and like everybody else. And I miss that. But we have to recognize that the important thing is the wine in the bottles, not the bottles, right? I mean, at the end of the day, much though I miss the glory of that, you have to also recognize that that's not how people are consuming content most of the time. I mean, I think there will always be a role for the luxury product magazine that is a kind of lovely tactile thing to have on your coffee table. But most of the magazines, we used to read are actually fading out, and particularly here, not so much in England. I mean, the magazines in England, there's still a newsstand culture, which there really isn't here, except at airports. So, you have to then think, okay, and that's why I started the Daily Beast, because it was a digital online news site. And at first I thought I'm not going to ever be that editor. I'm so much a magazine craft person. But I did find there's a lot of excitement in the digital, things you can do in the digital that you couldn't do. I mean, I'm the world's most impatient person. So, the instant gratification of news breaks, like Liz Truss is going, right? Get on the phone, know who to call, know who to text. Like, can you do this piece by, in 3 hours? And people did, because I had such a Rolodex of writers that I was able to persuade people to do things fast. And it was very, very good. I mean, we won News Site of the Year twice, actually. I think it's even harder. I mean, I did that in 2008 when homepages essentially were still of note and still of desire, if you like. And actually, I was proudest almost of the design of the Daily Beast, which is a beautiful looking site, actually. But of course, now, I mean, I never go to homepages, actually. So it's now completely disaggregated now. It's just about the pieces. And okay, so that's what it is. But you've then got to do the best pieces, And I think newsletters have become a very appealing way to get better quality writing and news. I mean, I subscribe to a lot of different newsletters. One I like very much actually is in England. It's called Tortoise, and it's very well written. It's just I was just reading it for all the Liz Truss stuff this morning. So I have constant news alerts coming in all of these newsletters, and of course I follow people on social media. So the whole question now is, how do we fund it? Right? That's the $1 million question. And actually, in memory of my husband, I've launched a fund in his name, the Sir Harry Evans Memorial Fund, which underwrites an annual investigative journalism fellowship for a young talent who will, because I've partnered with Reuters and David Thompson, it is that the winner is going to embed in the Reuters newsroom so that we actually can underwrite this new journalist talent. And we're also going to do an annual convening, the first of which is the first summit on investigative journalism is going to be next May. It's called Truth Tellers, and I'm very excited about it. But the reason I'm bringing it up actually is because I just read, I mean, we'll announce the new fellow on Monday, but the bundle of candidates was so extraordinary. It was really heartening. I mean, it's a global fellowship in journalism. So we had entries from Eastern Europe and China and Pakistan and I mean, brilliant journalists who are Africa, I mean, doing amazing work. And I'm thinking, how do these young people, how are they producing this work? And a lot of them are simply doing it out of passion. They try to find funding from nonprofits, and then and many of them also are great sort of data journalists, and they partner them with storytellers. So there's a whole new way of finding support for journalism. But all of them in their entries talked about their lack of community, that they felt they wanted the fellowship because they wanted to be actually in the Reuters newsroom. They wanted to be mentored. They wanted to have colleagues. They wanted to have help, essentially, in being molded. I mean, I spent time with my writers all the time, making their material better, telling them what I thought they should write rather than something else, with how I felt they would tell the story better. That's what they miss. They miss the editors, and they miss the collegial culture of a news organization. So that's one of the things that I think we need to really think about, is how else can we create networks of talent with people to support those networks, so that the essential work of investigative journalism continues, because without it, we'd all still be getting blood samples from Theranos, right? Theranos. Without that extraordinary investigation done by the Wall Street Journal, without so many. My husband's was, the thalidomide investigation, where he actually got compensation for the people who'd been utterly kicked to the curb, having been given this appalling drug. So we need journalism, and we must find new ways to support it.
So we only have a couple minutes left, but Tina, I need to ask you this. When you look back in the rearview mirror at what you built at Vanity Fair and the foundation then that Graydon Carter then ran with after that, but it feels like before that, a lot of these elements were much more siloed, right? Politics and business and celebrity and entertainment and society and so on, foreign policy. And then all of a sudden they come into this combustible mix, and everything is mixed up. To Vanity Fair becomes this huge brand. I know Graydon moved a lot of this further down the road, but the Oscar party and the White House Correspondents' Party and so on, and it really, I think, gave rise to this notion that Washington is like Hollywood for ugly people, or whatever the old saying is in a way. But when you look today at the polarization in our society, and that so many of our political figures, when they go on TV or simply auditioning for their post-congressional job at Fox or at MSNBC or whatever end of the political spectrum they're on, that we unintentionally kind of created this world where people have to be what they are not, in a sense, and it takes them away from what their core duty is: running a company, or trying to actually legislate and advance the country's agenda in a sense. That celebrity trumps all.
Well, I think, honestly, to go back to our first conversation, they need to look at how Queen Elizabeth II handled it as a CEO. The temptation not to take the long view, but to sort of jump into the mix and sort of be an out there celebrity is pretty deadly, I think, unless you understand how to manage that, right? It's about giving people, it's not unlike what Prince Charles faces, you have to give them enough to make sure your company is not a faceless entity, but not to the point that you forget that your real role is to run that company. And in terms of what I sort of did in journalism, in terms of the mix, as it were, that I brought to, say, Vanity Fair, of Hollywood and politics, there was one thread running through it, frankly, which was excellence, right? If you're going to do an interview with an actor, let it be as good in its way as an interview with, someone in the cabinet. It's all about standards, so the important thing is to bring those standards to whatever you're writing about, whether it's Hollywood or business or politics. You just want to do excellent work, and the work that's accurate, work that's has integrity and is rigorous. I didn't always get that right by any means, but I certainly strove for it. And when I was at the New Yorker, it was thrilling to have that challenge all the time, which is like, does it meet the standard? Is this good enough to be there? And I don't know how many people, essentially, because there is no budget and because things are so shrunk and staffs are so challenged, always people are very understaffed everywhere because of budget cuts. they sometimes really, I think, mourn a culture of excellence. They want it. And I saw that so much in these young applications. They're longing for cultures of excellence. And that makes me hopeful, because I think that desire is still very much there. And even though we've lived through this period of huge turbulent media disruption, I am sort of confident that other ways are going to be found to support excellence, because that's really what we're all hungering for, although we don't know it sometimes.
So finally, I want to end with where we began, because I know you're a phenomenal multitasker. So hopefully you've had a chance to even reflect, even as you're talking here today, about what has just transpired. So, in a sense, there's a tragic story that has unfolded here with Liz Truss, and she'll wind up being one of the shortest-lived prime ministers in British history. But what does that tell you? What do you as we look at Brexit, the potential departure long term of Scotland and even Northern Ireland, the splitting of the traditional constituents of the political parties, something's changing, and I just wonder what you think in your sort of initial reaction to the departure today of Liz Truss.
I mean, my reaction to the departure of Liz Truss is this is the end epilogue to lies. Right? And this is why media is so important. The fact is the country was lied to in Brexit. It was lied. People were told, for instance, that if they voted for Brexit, all the funding would now go to the national health. It wasn't true. Promises were made to people that could not be kept. We're seeing Britain, go from number 4 to number 11 in terms of its, GDP, etc. I mean, it's a disaster, really, what's happened, and at core of that disaster is dishonest media. Is when politicians can promulgate untruths and not have them checked and can see them, disseminated without check. It's very dangerous for the society itself. So and then you wind up with a completely unqualified prime minister, who has also been sort of swept away by the very thing that was the problem in the first place, which is just the, cacophony of negative media and an inability to even operate, essentially. So, I mean, I'm very keen on seeing the media piece got right, because I do believe that it's the great custodian of democracy and truth, and that the partisan era that we're in is because of the way the media now has split. Everyone is in an echo chamber. So hopefully we're going to come out of this dark time, the dark ages, the media dark ages.
Well, thank you for this. Tina Brown has been my guest today. Her newest book is The Palace Papers, and it is, as the Washington Post said, an addictive read. I really enjoyed it, and I thank you for your time today. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day.